Hello and welcome to revision tips for SIPS Level 5 Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 2, Managing Supply Chain Risk, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to understand and analyse risk mitigation strategies in your supply chain. So at the highest level, risks come from internal and external sources. So internally, it could be lack of available personnel, which can have, critical impacts on tasks, such as lack of cover over festive periods or lack of consistency. It could be lack of availability of machines and breakdowns, production machines or manufacturers, or a ventilator for a hospital or a server for a broadband provider. Issues with technology used to place orders, update receipts and arrange payments. And fraud committed by procurement and supply chain employees, resources being wrongly used for personal benefit. And the external risks could be a supplier failure, financial instability, IT or machine failure, labour strikes, weather and environmental factors, or interruption to water or electricity supply. The Australian Risk Management Standard 4360 was one of the first risk management standards to exist. And there are 6 stages in the process, which is similar to those that we process in ISO 31000. This is what you can see on the slide. So the first step is to establish the context. So define the scope for the risk management process and agree the criteria against which risks will be assessed. And the scope within the organisation in terms of its strategy or its project objectives. Identify the risks using methods such as environmental scanning, stakeholder engagement, or comparison with similar projects. This could be used, you could use tools like steepled analysis, stakeholder engagement, looking at similar projects and purchases in the supply chain. The third is to analyse and evaluate the risks, assess the probability and the impact of a potential event, and record this in a risk register. We then treat the risk, putting in place measures to control it and take action. Communicate and consult, keeping stakeholders informed depending on their involvement, power and influence. And then monitor and review. Monitor the horizon for other potential risks and update the status of the current ones. Now, following this process, it might lead to an increased likelihood of identifying risks early and therefore being able to put in place measures to reduce the impact. Step 2 is to assess the probability and impact. So having identified the risk, you need to assess them in terms of how likely they're going to happen and the impact they will have if they do. Now, each risk can be scored using a scale, such as what you can see on the slide. I usually use a sort of 1 to 5 approach, so 1 being very low, 5 being high. And you would do that for the probability and the impact. And that will then put you into a risk category, either being very low, low, medium, low to medium, medium to high, high, or even very high. And if you use this in number terms, a 5 times 5 would be 25, which is a very, very high category of risk. Now, supply chain vulnerability is an organisation's level of exposure to disturbances to continuity of their operations that arise from supply chain risks. So supply chain vulnerability occurs as a result of complexity of supply chains in terms of length and distance, weak links in the connections and interactions between various players in the supply chain, as well as issues with processes, policies and technologies. So here you can see some examples of where vulnerability assessments might highlight issues: quality, fraud, the environment, finance, health and safety, IT, fire, marketing, security and buildings, HR and natural disasters. So supply chain vulnerability is an organisation's level of exposure. So here you can see that vulnerability assessments shouldn't just be focused on the first tier of the suppliers. They should be driven down further in the supply chain to look for potential weak spots. And the supply chain vulnerability is considered to be increasing due to political instability, lengthening supply chains, Now, a high, medium, low assessment of each area is helpful, but it's a bit blunt and doesn't really take into account any subtleties or difficulties and can be a bit too simplistic or sophisticated for sophisticated activities in procurement. So to give a greater degree of robustness, statistical techniques can be included. There are a range of statistical techniques that can be used to assess the likelihood or probability of something happening. And we start with those shown here and consider whether events are dependent or independent of each other. So an impact probability matrix can be used as a simple high, medium, low approach. Probability is the measure of how likely something is to happen, measured on a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 is impossible and 1 is guaranteed. So if a coin is tossed, the probability of it being heads is 0.5 or 50%. It must be one or the other. They are mutually exclusive. If you've got 5 balls in a jar, 4 red and 1 white, then the probability of drawing the white ball is 1 in 5, or 0.2, 20%. And the probabilities here are dependent on each other. If you remove one of the red balls, the chances of drawing a white ball next time are higher. It's 1 in 4, 25%. But what's the probability of drawing a white ball the time after that? Is it still 1 of 4? The two events are independent of each other. And whilst it might seem intuitively unlikely, statistically it's completely possible. The arithmetic mean is the best known type of average where the total value of items divided by the total number of items in a data set gives you this mean. The median is the middle term of data, once all records have been placed in order of magnitude. This approach is easy to understand and it's not influenced by any outlying records. However, the average may not be representative. The mode is more frequently occurring value and is determined by observing rather than calculating. It may be there is no mode value in the dataset, rendering this average unsuitable. The midpoint or average in the dataset may not be a good representation of the distribution of the data, so the data may be clustered around a particular point or may be more widely distributed. So the use of an average together with a measurement of dispersion can be a useful tool. Measuring the range of data set assesses the difference between the highest and lowest points of the data. This measure offers no guidance about how the data is dispersed within that range and is therefore, again, practically little value. Now, a standard deviation is much more useful measure of dispersion, but it's a little bit more complicated to calculate. It does assess the distance that data is away from the mean. So if data is close to the mean, then the distance from the mean is small, and the standard deviation measure is simply very similarly small. Standard deviations are calculated using spreadsheets or scientific calculators. But most people are comfortable with the concept of an average. For example, if purchases values between 50 and 7,000, there would be an average value of 250. But again, this can be very blunt. If your head is in the oven and your feet are in the freezer, your body is at an average temperature. So there are other more useful measures to look at. The outlier lies outside the normal pattern, so it's either much higher or much lower than the average. There will also often be a long tail, lots of values that sit outside the expected range, but they don't occur very often. So outliers and long tails can skew statistical results, so much that they give completely inaccurate calculations of an average. But they also represent significant events, high value orders warranting special treatment or a special type of defect. So when doing analysis, identify and remove them from the standard or bulk calculation and deal with them separately. So the standard deviation is the measure of how far the range of values is from the mean. It is a complex calculation, but A defining characteristic of a technique is that 95% of values will always fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. Knowing that the range of values covered by 95% figure, you can give some certainty that the value of the event will be within that range. This knowledge is useful for predicting assessments and demand and how often something is likely to happen. A wide range makes it harder to predict the results and forecast the future. So here again, you can see the outliers response region. It's statistically significant, and the result can be relied upon as worthy once you take those out of the occasion. So far, we've looked at statistical calculations related to normal distribution, also known as the bell curve frequency distribution. And this is a very valuable approach, but it doesn't cover every eventuality. There are 2 others that can give us additional assistance. A binominal distribution is used where there are only 2 possible events. It happens or it doesn't happen. And the frequency with which it happens can be calculated to indicate the relative probability of an unwanted event, like a risk happening. The Poisson distribution, which was named after a French mathematician, considers how often something may happen in a given time period. So if a piece of machinery was to be delivered to site, but the ability to do so was weather dependent, the Poisson distribution could be used to assess how often poor weather occurred in that area, so the risk of poor weather occurring on the day the delivery was scheduled could be calculated. This would allow for a more precise assessment of probability to feed into your impact matrix, and would allow for a more accurate assessment of the impact too. But binominal means there's only 2 outcomes. And Poisson is usually used to identify how often a single event may happen in a chain of independent events. As with all documents and systems, the risk register or log will only be as good and as useful as the information put into them. Quality of entry and organisational-wide understanding of the need for accurate and timely risk recording is essential to be successful of any risk management process. So they should be maintained and up to date. New risks should be logged and assessed. And if any risk occurs, then it's recorded together with the outcomes. If an identified risk doesn't occur, this will also be recorded because it's like you've avoided the risk. And it provides organisational learning resources for future projects and activities. At its best, risk identification should include a range of personnel who are exposed to different activities within an organisation. So this should be a cross-functional activity. One individual function would not have a span of experience required to determine all the risks that exist in an organisation. When you're completing your risk assessment, you will look at the overall impact of the risk. So it's essentially probability of the risk multiplied by the impact factor. And the source of the risk could be internal, external, or other. Probability can be from low to very high, and the impact from low to very high. And this just shows you a generic framework that you could use in a risk register. If you have a risk register in your own organisation, you could use this framework to critically evaluate whether or not it's fit for purpose, or whether there are areas that could be improved. It can be held at board level, functional level, or project level. It should be initiated as soon as new products are being designed and updated. And as suppliers are being considered and as risks are being identified, the risk register should be reviewed on a regular basis. The challenge here arises from the leadership, management and culture of an organisation. And in some organisations, managers may be reluctant to include internal stakeholders across functions, let alone their external stakeholders. So a RACI tool is useful for overcoming resistance to this and for reassuring senior managers and key stakeholders that there is an efficient risk management in place. or at least to know that they will be informed if there's a need for contingency planning. Procurement might enable a range of different organisational activities from different departments. So, for example, a procurement department at a hospital may support the procurement of medicines for outpatients, or surgical equipment for inpatients, or procurement of stationery for the staff working in different support roles. But availability of any of these items will have different impacts at different departments. So the cancellation of surgery would have a very high impact to the patient, and lack of medicines for the outpatients might affect a greater number of patients. So therefore, procurement must work closely with the various departments and support their operations, maintenance, sales, to produce realistic assessment of risk and the impact. So the RACI tool is useful for including your stakeholders in risk management, understanding who is responsible, who is accountable, who you must consult and keep informed. And stakeholders can be considered in terms of how much power they can yield that can influence their actions and how quickly they need to be responded to, but also how legitimate their needs are. Now, a traditional stakeholder mapping is used as a Mendelow's matrix, which we may have seen before in other modules. But there are other factors that can be considered, such as power, the ability to influence actions, urgency, how quickly they want to be responded to, and legitimacy, the strength of their claim. And these together can provide a greater insight and understanding of their interest and influence. There are definitive stakeholders that have all three of these attributes. Expectant ones have two of the attributes, and latent stakeholders only have one. This model helps procurement professionals to understand which stakeholders need to be communicated with and why. It is wider than traditional power influence matrix mapping and is more available to the wider stakeholder audience considered in procurement and operational risk management. There are two overlapping ways to classify stakeholders in the first model. First of all, we see the power if they're legitimate and how quickly they need to be responded to in terms of urgency. So a definitive stakeholder has real power, legitimate authority, and who needs an answer now. This could be the Office of Fair Trading or an industry regulatory body. The local community or the pressure groups could be classified as discretionary because they don't in themselves have the power and there is no hurry. Now, standards enable organisations to understand and bring together the various approaches so that supply chain partners can be prepared with responses as demanding by buying organisations. The importance of international standards for risk management has increased as a result of the willingness for multiple governments to reduce trade barriers and grow for multinational trade blocs increases. So essentially, the guiding principles behind this is it creates and protects value, is an integral part of your process and decision making. It explicitly addresses uncertainty and is systematic, structured and timely based on best available information. It can be tailored and takes human and cultural factors into account. It's transparent and inclusive, dynamic, iterative and responsive to change, and it facilitates continual improvement and enhancements. And this page just shows you a summary of what you might see in ISO 31000. Feel free to pause it at this stage and just have a look at some of the stuff that's on here. You can see on the right hand side, for example, the risk identification, the analysis and the evaluation. And we're going to talk in a bit about the risk treatment. ISO 28000 is about supply chain security. This facilitates trade and expedites the transport of goods across borders, monitors and manages security risks, gains a competitive advantage and win-win business, encourages companies to secure their own processes in the supply chain, reassuring stakeholders the commitment of safety and security, allowing managers to focus their finite resources on areas of greatest concern. The benchmark security management practices within best practice, achieving cost savings through reduced incidents and insurance premiums, gaining opportunities to improve efficiency across working practice. And here is just a reminder of the risk management process. The focus for SIPs is what it used to traditionally be on something called the 4Ts, although there are considerable alignments between the 4Ts and an ACAT model. These models can be seen as other potential responses to risks. So when planning a mitigation strategy for risk, it wouldn't be the case of just jumping and using one of these. It's likely that all of them would be used in combination. So to prevent against the risk of a fire, there would be policies in place to try and avoid it, such as no naked flames being allowed. But a major fire starts next door and spreads. It's not possible to completely avoid it. So the impacts can be controlled, such as the use of fire doors, sprinklers, extinguishers, evacuation procedures. Disaster recovery and business continuity would also be considered as part of this. And they could still be compensated for the loss. So the 4Ts says that depending on the likelihood and consequences, you will either tolerate a low risk, treat a high likelihood but low consequence one, transfer a low likelihood but high consequences one, and terminate ones where there are high likelihood and high consequences. So the 4Ts are treat, terminate, tolerate, and transfer. And the ACAT model is very similar mnemonic. It's about avoid, control, accept, and transfer, but it's basically the same thing. Now, this slide shows you another approach which can lead to a wider range of potential activities to mitigate against risks. Some of these are more proactive, such as directive activities, and they seek to achieve positive outcomes rather than preventing negative ones from happening. So the 4 approaches are ways of treating, controlling, and mitigating risks. So preventative is to limit the possibility of a negative outcome. Directive is to ensure positive outcomes through legislation, processes, and procedures. Detective is to evaluate and monitor potential risks occurring so that you can take action. And corrective is designed to counter any known risks, so business continuity, continuity plans, and crisis management. Risks and the mitigating strategies for dealing with them may also have a need to be reported outside of procurement or the team involved in an activity. Some of the reporting channels given have mandatory reporting, such as those for external auditors or for regulatory purposes, such as Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Others are to maintain robustness, such as ISO accreditation, and others are completely voluntary but help to boost stakeholder engagement, such as departments and other key suppliers. But the later part of risk management process does involve communication and monitoring, which is likely to take place with the wider stakeholder group, not just the procurement team. So, for example, departments outside procurement who are affected by activities would include the key suppliers. The board of directors and other shareholders may want to know about them. Auditors, either financial or the production of annual accounts for an accreditation or an external standards body such as ISO. And although individual activities will need to be specific to a risk exercise, risk management is best thought of as a way of thinking within an organisation so that it becomes embedded in normal day-to-day activities rather than being treated as a one-off event. In effect, the aim should be for it to become part of the culture, but achieving this will require a degree of flexibility in some areas of the organisation. So it's thought of as a way of thinking, right, as I said, so don't treat it as a one-off activity. But your risk culture would require sourcing approaches such as dual sourcing, which means you're covering against the risk of single sourcing. Asset sharing, so your risk can be dispersed. Recognizing base demand so that the surges and impacts can be assessed. And rapid and agile manufacturing so that organizations can respond to surges and impacts. So let's look at preparing a contingency plan. It consists of three distinct phases. The incident response, which takes place during the incidents. So the key components are detection and reaction, focuses on people's safety, and should include identifying the issue and communicating it to key personnel, reacting quickly and effectively in a way that can help to minimize damage. Then the disaster recovery plan, which takes place hours after the incident. Key components here is to get critical systems operational, and then the next step is to identify the damage to the organisation the incident has caused. And then days after the incident is the business continuity plan. Here you're going to prioritise getting your business functions operational, and it should be put into action to get all your organisation's critical systems operational. So for effective contingency planning, each of these phases needs to be carefully prepared, practiced and executed. So the scenario planning and problem situations and solutions should be available to implement. And it's unlikely that the crisis situation will be exactly the same as the practice, so some modifications will be needed to meet the requirements and the context of the crisis. And here's just an example of a continuity plan. Now, preparing a business continuity plan, you need to firstly start with analysing your business. This includes consulting with senior and major stakeholders and understanding their interactions. What is the key to running the business and what plans are in place? It's important to understand all parts of the business to get buy-in and communicate the importance of business continuity. You then assess the risks, give any risks an impact and likelihood score. Scenario analysis is useful here, with stakeholders encouraged to ask "what if" questions and have a plan to cover all scenarios will significantly reduce the impact of the risks. Then develop your strategy involving all of the organisational risks owners and look at their risk appetite in order to decide which risks you want to take, which you want to tolerate and which you want to treat. And decide whether your own organisation takes charge or whether it's better to transfer that to a supplier who is an expert in business continuity planning. If you use a third party, it may limit costs but be complex, and a third party can also act as detached and unemotional. Then develop your plan, balance simplicity with necessity, including accessible language, a racy matrix, and immediate and less urgent checklists. Each disaster recovery plan must be concise, comprehensive, clear, and current. And it should include all the important contact numbers, including your local authorities, emergency services, and other key contacts like your customers and suppliers, your insurance organisation. It should consider who will be involved, what they will do, when they should carry out their responsibilities, where they should work, and how they will do it. So finally, rehearse your plan. This could be a paper-based exercise or involve cascading information and instructions via a text message, or could even be a full-scale rehearsal. It will become clear whether the plan covers everything relevant and whether it's viable. And if any gaps or issues are found, the plan can be updated. Thank you for watching.